Hello and welcome back to another installment of Air Action Weekly's Spicy Air Tales. As always, I'm Dave Davis Patterson. This week we continue with Charlie Steele and the First Knights. A tale of how the renowned Hollywood Knights found their footing and first made it off the ground. This week we only have 3 voices in the studio with me. First up, reprising her role as our narrator, Miss Nancy Warner.
Mastering her mounting terror, Charlie grabbed the stick again and this time pulled as hard as she could.
And the wonderful Miss Sarah Coder as Charlie Steele.
I should have kept my damn helmet on.
And joining us today is Jason O'Neill playing Edward Steele.
I trust I make myself clear?
Indeed you do. And I will be continuing my role as Mr. Reed Champion. We begin right where we left off last week, when Reed Champion bailed out of the crashing plane, leaving our heroine Charlie Steele with little options. Let's see what happens next.
The wind screamed past Charlie's ears as the plane dived towards its doom. Cursing the name of Reed Champion, who had jumped from the plane with the only parachute, she struggled to release herself from the straps, which held her fast in her seat. But with the plane headed straight down, her weight straining at the straps made it impossible to unhook them. Gritting her teeth, Charlie dug her heels into the floorboards of the little plane and pushed back against the force of gravity. By thrusting as hard as she could, she was able to give herself just enough slack to unhook the straps. She grabbed onto the now flapping harness and looked around desperately. Below her, the ground was coming up at a horrifying rate. Above her, the empty cockpit, so recently abandoned by Reed, mocked her. She didn't have a lot of options. In a flash, Charlie realized that it was all up to her. Her father wasn't going to come along and make this one all better. If she was going to survive, it had to be through her own moxie. Putting every ounce of energy she had into it, Charlie began to climb up the harness and out of the cockpit. As soon as her head rose above the fuselage, it was slammed forward by the wind. Her forehead bounced painfully off a metal rivet as she felt a trickle of blood run down her cheek.
I should have kept my damn helmet on,
she thought to herself. Holding on as tightly as she could, Charlie continued to pull herself up out of her cockpit and, grabbing onto the lip of the pilot's cockpit in front of her, she began to crawl up the body of the plane. The wind was howling in her ears and plucking at her body, trying to pull her free from the plummeting aircraft. With a last grunt of effort, she made it over the small windscreen and into the relative safety of the pilot's cockpit, leaving a smear of blood along the edge of the plexiglass. Pushing, straining, and practically sending her heels through the floor of the plane, Charlie managed to get into the pilot's seat and buckle herself in. She looked at the control panel for the first time in her life, and soon realized she didn't understand what any of the gauges meant, but she was willing to bet it wasn't anything good. The only thing that looked familiar was the flight stick, since she had seen Reed fooling with the thing before he bailed. She grabbed the stick with both hands and gave it a light, experimental tug. The stick, however, remained rigidly in place, and the plane continued its dive towards the valley floor, now terrifyingly close. Mastering her mounting terror, Charlie grabbed the stick again and this time pulled as hard as she could. At first nothing happened, then gradually she began to feel some movement in the stick and the nose of the plane seemed to pull up slightly. With everything she had, Charlie pulled back and the plane finally began to pull out of its dive. In agonizing slow motion, the nose came up and the ground tilted away under her. As the rocky terrain receded, Charlie gave a moan of relief and eased up on the flight stick. With a start, she realized that she had let it go too far as the plane began to nose down again. Startled, she jerked it back and managed to get the plane flying fairly straight. A rough calculation, based on what little she could manage to gather from the instrument panel, showed that she was flying east, about 500 feet above the valley floor. With a sudden start, Charlie realized something that shocked her. She was having fun. In spite of her fear, in spite of her fury at Reed for abandoning her, and even in spite of the fact that she was still very likely going to die when she tried to land the thing, Charlie had to admit that she was having the time of her life. She finally got the hang of the flight stick, and the plane seemed to be responding immediately to her every move. For the first time in her life, Charlie felt completely in control. But it couldn't last long. The plane had picked up a huge amount of speed during its terrifying descent, but now that it was level, it seemed to be losing that speed rapidly. Charlie could feel the plane slowing down and beginning to lose altitude. This plane was definitely no glider. Its stubby wings had been designed for maneuverability, not for extended lift, and it was coming down fast. Charlie looked around frantically. By this time, she was about 300 feet above the floor of the valley, which was mostly farmland. Unfortunately, right here it was mostly orange groves, and Charlie figured that landing on treetops wasn't such a good idea. Up ahead, she saw a stretch of dirt road. It was long, straight, and flat, but pretty narrow. Worse than that, it was running horizontal across her flight path. Figuring that at this point she had nothing to lose, Charlie shoved the stick over to the left and screamed as the plane banked sharply into a tight turn. By the time she was able to fight the stick back up to a straight position, she discovered that she was now flying northwest, away from the road. Worse, she'd lost a lot of altitude in that maneuver and was now less than 150 feet above the ground. Much more carefully this time, Charlie eased the flight stick to the right and was rewarded by feeling the plane come around, heading back towards the road. Charlie whooped with relief and prepared herself for some serious maneuvering. It was going to be close. The plane was slowing more and more and still dropping rapidly. Charlie could see the road up ahead, but the trees were coming up at her awfully fast. She could hear her wheels brushing the tops of the trees as she banked to line up with the road, her wings scraping through the trees. Now she was rushing along the road, with the trees whipping by on either side. Sending up a prayer to a God whom up until now she hadn't even believed in, Charlie eased the stick forward and the plane nosed down. But Charlie wasn't a pilot, and she had no way of knowing that she was still going far too fast to attempt a landing, nor that her angle was much too steep. She landed with a bone-shaking jolt that threw her forward violently and crumpled the left landing strut. The left wing caught the ground as the plane flew to the left, tipping up on the wing and crashing into the trees. The last thing Charlie saw was a curtain of greenery racing towards her.
And that takes us into our sponsor. Stay tuned for more of this week's Spicy Air Tale.
Have you tried Wheaties? They're whole wheat with all of the bran. Won't you try Wheaties? For wheat is the best food of man. They're crispy and crunchy the whole year through. The kiddies never tire of them, and neither will you. So just buy Wheaties, the best breakfast food in the land.
Welcome back to Spicy Air Tales. We return to Charlie Steele and the First Knights.
When she came to, Charlie was aware of only a few things. Firstly, that every part of her body hurt, particularly her head, and then, that the world was green and turned upside down. Slowly getting her bearings, Charlie discovered that she was in fact not dead, as she had first suspected, but was hanging upside down in a grove of orange trees, held in place by the pilot's harness. She estimated that she was about 15 feet above the ground, but couldn't quite figure out whether the ground was above her or below her. All around her was the greenery of the trees on which the plane was now resting, the overpowering smell of oranges mixed with another, less pleasant smell. What was that smell? Suddenly, Charlie recognized it. Airplane fuel.
Uh-oh.
She thought.
Time to go.
She struggled frantically with the straps as the smell of aviation fuel grew stronger. With a sudden explosion, a ball of fire shot out of the engine of the small plane, straight towards her face. With a final, desperate yank, Charlie pulled the straps free from their moorings and dropped out of her seat just as the wall of flame filled the cockpit. Feeling the heat cinch her hair, Charlie landed like a sack of potatoes on the ground, knocking the breath out of her. She slowly pulled herself away from the burning airframe, which fell out of the trees in an explosion of sparks. Aching in every limb and a little singed, Charlie staggered to her feet and stumbled through the orchard towards the nearby road. Catching her breath, she heard the sound of an ancient engine. Looking up, she saw a truck full of worried-looking men heading down the road towards her. Charlie waved feebly.
Hey, fellas. Give a girl a lift?
And that takes us into our last sponsored segment. Stay tuned for the dramatic conclusion of Chapter 2 of The First Nights.
Pepsi Cola hits the spot. 12 full ounces, that's a lot. Twice as much for a nickel, too. Pepsi Cola is the drink for you.
Welcome back to the dramatic conclusion of Chapter 2 of The First Nights.
The taxi pulled to a stop in front of the Steele mansion, but Charlie stayed where she was. The farmers had been very kind about the whole thing, especially once she identified who she was, and told them that her father would make good on any damage to their orchard. They had taken her back to the farmhouse, where a very motherly woman had bandaged her up a bit and helped her get herself reasonably clean. They even helped her cut her singed curls into a neat bob. They also let her use the phone. She had considered calling her father directly and having him send out a car, but somehow she didn't feel up to that. Instead, she had called for a taxi. The fare would be incredible, but that wouldn't be a problem when she got home, and at least that would put off the inevitable confrontation with her father. It wasn't that he would be angry. It was more that she suddenly didn't feel like being fussed over, which felt strange, since she usually loved being the center of attention.
Well,
she thought,
might as well get it over with.
She marched up the front door and rang the bell. She told the maid, who opened the door slack-jawed at her singed clothing and bruised face, to pay the cabbie and give him a big tip. Squaring her shoulders, she headed up to her father's study. Just as she was about to knock, she heard a voice, which set her jaw on edge.
I'm sorry to have to be the one to bring you the news, Mr. Steele. You know the type of girl she was. I told her to stop fooling with the controls, but she wouldn't do it. She pulled the flight stick and threw us into a dive. We were so close to the ground that there was no chance to pull up. I barely bailed out in time. I only wish that I'd had time to get the parachute to her. I'd give anything to have it be me instead of her in that seat.
Charlie threw the door open with enough force to knock over a bottle in the liquor cabinet along the wall. Reed was standing next to her father, who was sitting behind his desk with his head in his hands. At the sound of the door, he looked up and jumped to his feet.
Charlie, you're alive.
Ignoring him completely, Charlie stormed towards Reed, who looked like he might throw up.
You filthy liar. I wasn't the one who stalled us out up there with some stupid trick. And I wasn't the one who lost his nerve and jumped ship. And I wasn't the one who took the only parachute.
She screamed, jabbing her finger into his chest with every point.
Charlie, I'm sorry. I didn't know.
You didn't know what? That I'd survive? That I'd be able to pull the plane out of the dive you left me in? That I'd get back here to tell the whole world what a liar you are?
Her voice suddenly became a bullet as she yelled.
Get out of my house and get out of my life.
Reed turned to Edward Steele, but he was getting no help from that quarter. Steele looked at him with a cold, hard stare that Charlie had never seen on him before.
Mr. Champion, I think that you had better leave. I don't ever want to see you around me, my daughter, or my property again. I trust I make myself clear?
Reed drew himself up and scowled.
All right, I'm going. But our business here isn't through, and you haven't seen the last of me. I'll be back.
With that, he stormed out of the room, and a few seconds later, the sound of the front door slamming echoed back to their ears. Charlie was relieved to have Reed out of her life, and thankful that their relationship hadn't progressed any further than it had. But she was troubled by his parting words. What did he mean by "our business here isn't through"? And there was no denying the menace in his words, "I'll be back." What further troubles did this bitter threat portend?
Thank you all for listening to this week's segment of Spicy Air Tales. Tune in next week for Chapter 3 of The First Nights. Up next, we have the AAW Swing Band. As usual, they are bound to get you moving as you cruise those crimson skies. But first, a word from our sponsors.